Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Welcome to the Hannah Arendt Center's virtual reading group. We are reading today Hannah Arendt's essay, The Conquest of Space and the Stature of Man. This was originally written in 1963 for a contest or a symposium called the Symposium on Space, and it was published by Arendt in the American Scholar magazine, and then republished with slight edits in Between Past and Future in the second edition. It's the only essay that was added to the second edition that wasn't in the first edition of the book. This is an essay that picks up on many of the themes of her book, The Human Condition, especially from the prologue to The Human Condition and the final chapter on the Vita Activa and the modern age. The book is very much about science and the question of how science transforms what it means to be human. In The Human Condition, in the prologue, you may recall that for her, man has at least two competing parts to himself. On the other hand, he's earthly. That means he's born into a world that is there beyond his control. He deals with fate and fortune and has to deal with a world and deal with things that are beyond his control. On the other hand, man is an artificer, one who can remake the world, make it towards his will, toward his image. And it's this ability to do so, this split ability, which is the seat of human freedom. On the one hand, we are not free to make the world exactly as we will. It's natural and we're fated. On the other hand, we can, in some sense, make our world. And one of the questions she raises in the Human Condition, and it's the question of this essay as well, is what happens when we increasingly acquire the scientific and technological ability to remake not only parts of our world, but the entire world? What happens when we can create new planets, create completely artificial worlds that we make with our intent? What happens when we can clone and grow designer human beings who are made with human intent and are thus not natural or fated? What happens to human freedom in such a world? And in many ways, that is the question. And in The Human Condition, Arendt is struggling with this question of what happens to the human condition in the modern age, the age of science and technology. And she says we need to think about it. We need to think what we are doing. And this essay is a further attempt to do that. She begins with the question of the contest that she entered, or the symposium, which was, has man's conquest of space increased or diminished his stature? And the obvious answer is increased his stature, right? We go to the heavens, shows how great humans are, that we can do such things. So how would it diminish human stature? Well, insofar as if we can go to space and we can begin to control the heavens and even control man, man becomes simply another being, another entity, not the great entity in the world. If we begin to understand ourselves not as humans on Earth, but cosmically, we get smaller. And that is, in many ways, the question she raises. And what she says is, to answer this question is not a scientific activity. Scientists have no advantage over humanists in trying to answer the question of what happens to the dignity or stature of man in the age of science. This should remind us of the passages at the end of the Crisis and Culture essay, which we read a couple weeks ago in Between Past and Future, where she says on um, on page 221 that there's an old saying of Cicero's, which goes, "I prefer before heaven to go astray with Plato rather than hold true views with his opponents." This elevation of the friendship with Plato over and against the true views of his opponents is what Arendt talks about as a judgment of taste and as the true humanist approach. One who is not a specialist, who doesn't concern themselves with questions of truth per se, but makes a judgment of taste, a free judgment of taste. And that's really what's at issue for her in this essay, in The Conquest of Space. Does the conquest of space make it more difficult or potentially even impossible at some point for humans to remain free to make judgments of taste, for humans to remain humanists in the sense that they can choose friendships freely over and against some determinative truth? She forms this as on page 260 into a remarkable sentence in which she says, quote, "It has been the glory of modern science that it has been able to emancipate itself completely from all such anthropocentric, that is truly humanist, concerns." And this is something that is at the root of much of Arendt's writing and thinking, which is that science is antithetical to humanism. She says something similar to this in the beginning of the essay, "What is Freedom?" where she says that at war with freedom is the idea of scientific determinism. And what she's saying here is that science, what does science do? Well, it asks why. It asks, what are the reasons? What is the reason that something happens? And it is not satisfied with the obvious, apparent reason. It seeks the reason behind the reason, the cause behind the cause. It seeks to go beneath, right? We see the sun rise, but science tells us no, the earth is going around the sun. And so science takes us away from our sort of earthly, human, sensible reasons. And that's the glory of modern science. It emancipates itself from our humanistic concerns. So in doing so, science is at war with common sense, and that should be obvious. Science seeks the explanations that are behind and often undo common sense. What we learn from science is the truth that is not apparent in the world that we see, not a truth of sense experience. Thus, science does not give a human experience of the world. And this is a really important point for Hannah Arendt. It's not just about augmenting and ordering human experiences. It's something quite different. And so on page 262, she quotes Niels Bohr, who says, quote, "Only by renouncing an explanation of life in the ordinary sense do we gain a possibility of taking into account its characteristics. We have to renounce ordinary, common sense human life in order to learn the scientific truth." And she says then again on page 262 at the bottom, running on to 263, "For the point of the matter is, of course, that modern science has changed and reconstructed the world we live in so radically that it could be argued that the layman and the humanist, still trusting their common sense and communicating in everyday language, are out of touch with reality. Science has so transformed our reality that those of us who are not scientists are living a world. We go by our daily lives out of touch with what's true and really going on. Um, uh, and so the scientists can look at us and say, "You're ignorant. You ignoramuses. You don't know what you're doing." Um, and yet, it's not so simple. She says. She says the scientist also is in part a layman. Even the scientist thinks from the perspective of a layman, some, if not most, of the time, and can't fully accept or understand the world of science. So she says, quote, "The scientist has not only left behind the layman with his limited understanding, he has left behind a part of himself and his own power of understanding, which is still human understanding, when he goes to work in the laboratory and begins to communicate in mathematical language." So the scientist, in a sense, has to leave behind, if not kill, a part of himself in order to be a true scientist. She has this wonderful example of the confusion of the brain and the mind here, right? The brain, she thinks of, is like a complicated machine. And so she says on 264, "If it should be true that we are surrounded by machines whose doings we cannot comprehend, although we have devised and constructed them, it would mean that the theoretical perplexities of the natural sciences on the highest level have invaded our everyday world." So we can create machines, right? This happens all the time, in which the machine then does things which we couldn't do, and we can't truly understand. And she says, this is a problem, because we are now creating things which make things and do things that not only don't we understand, but we can't express in human language. We can't actually, the world that our creations will create may be a world that is beyond our human understanding. And this raises a question. Will we as humans expand? Will we grow in our understanding so that we can understand this world? Arendt doesn't think we will, right? So she says on page 265, "The trouble is that what defies description in terms of prejudices," so these are the prejudices that we have as common sense humans, and if we build things that do things we can't comprehend, that defies description in terms of our human prejudices. But the trouble is that what defies description in terms of prejudices of the human mind defies description in every conceivable way of human language. It can no longer be described at all, and it is being expressed but not described in mathematical processes. Now, there are people, futurists like Ray Kurzweil and others, who think that the way we solve this is that humans become cyborgs. We implant ourselves with nanotechnology and chips in such a way that we can begin to comprehend what our machines do. But Arendt is not thinking that way. And what she says on 266 is that this hope that we will be able to, in some sense, keep up with and understand this new world. She says this hope, I'm afraid, will be disappointed. The categories and ideas of human reason have their ultimate source in human sense experience, and all terms describing our mental abilities, as well as a good deal of our conceptual language, derive from the world of the senses and are used metaphorically. This is a point she makes quite specifically in the Life of the Mind and other texts, she does believe that human thinking comes out of metaphors that all begins with the senses. So even our abstractions begin with the sensible world and the world of appearance. And that thinking that is purely abstract and mechanical opposes the world of our senses and cannot ever be described in language. The result of this, for her, is a real challenge to the idea of our earthliness. And so she writes on 266 again, the human brain, which supposedly does our thinking, is as terrestrial, earthbound, as any other part of the human body. Modern science appeals to, quote, a power of imagination and abstraction that would, as it were, lift the human mind out of the gravitational field of the earth and look down upon it from some point in the universe. So the human brain is supposed to be earthly. And yet what science does is it allows us to think from a point outside the earth. And this is what she calls in The Human Condition, and mentions here again, this idea of the Archimedean point. So the idea of a point, Archimedean point, is the lever that one can use to manipulate something. Archimedes thought of a point way outside the universe where you could have a lever long enough to lever the earth. Is there a point at which we can, in a sense, think from so far outside the earth that we could, in a sense, control the earth, remake it, see the earth simply as something to be understood, not as our home on which we live. And this is the transition point of the essay, because now what she does is she asks, okay, scientists themselves, they're just interested in this because they like difficult questions. They want to know. They want to know what the world is. They're not actually interested in changing the world, remaking it. But once they've begun to think this way, and once this way of thinking, where we think that everything has a reason and the reason can be found, and thus nothing is simply, but always has a reason. And if there's a reason for it, we can understand it, control it, remake it. If that's the case, we can change the world. We can remake nature. We can remake Earth. We can remake humanity. And this is the distinction that she now raises between scientists and plumbers. Plumbers being technologists, engineers. And what she says is there are many more plumbers in the world than there are scientists. And the plumbers are the ones who actually want to make a difference and change things. And they're the ones who are more important. What the scientists and the plumbers share is a conviction that the world, the human world, the common sense world, is not really the real world. That there's a truer world. Now, for the scientists, this is a question of knowledge. There's a real, truer world that we can discover. For the plumber, it's a question of will to power. There's a better world, when I will more, that we can create or make. So for the scientist, she has in mind someone like Werner Heisenberg, who writes, and she quotes this on 271, the modern search for a true reality behind mere appearances, that's the scientific search for a true reality, has led to a situation in the sciences themselves in which man has lost the very objectivity of the natural world, so that man in his hunt for objective reality suddenly discovered that he always confronts himself alone. Now this is drawn out of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the idea that in viewing a phenomena, we also alter the phenomena. And this connects to Martin Heidegger's idea of um, the age of technique, that in the traditional understanding of the world, there are subjects and objects. There's a human subject and an object that we know. And in German, that's a Gegenstand. The object is that which stands against the subject. Heidegger argues that in the age of technology, things move from being objects, Gegenstand, objects, things thrown against, Objektum in Latin, to being Bestand. They lose their stand. They become standing for the use of man. They lose their objectivity and they become simply being useful, being completely subject to, at the demand of, to be made use of the subjects. And Arendt is here saying something similar. When we now encounter the world, we don't encounter objects, we only encounter ourselves. And so she says on 271-2, all of this makes it more unlikely every day that man will encounter anything in the world around him that is not man-made, and hence is not, in the last analysis, himself in a different disguise. There is no, when we see a river, we no longer see this mighty river that has been set in motion by forces beyond our control. We see something that we understand, that at least conceivably how it was made through historical processes. But we also understand that we could dam it, we could redirect it, we could drain it. And thus the river is not something that stands against us with its own force, but it becomes something for us and we can control it. And this is a way in which we see only ourselves in it. To the extent we let the river be, that's not because the river needs to be, it's because we choose that. And this leads to one of the most powerful metaphors, I think, in all of Arendt's writing. This idea of the astronaut shot into space, living in a space capsule, fully made by man. And so she writes, page 272, the astronaut shot into space and imprisoned in his instruments-ridden capsule, where each actual physical encounter with his surroundings would spell immediate death if he were out in the world, in the space, might well be taken, this astronaut in his capsule, might well be taken as the symbolic incarnation of Heisenberg's man, the man who will be the less likely ever to meet anything but himself and a man-made things, the more ardently he wishes to eliminate all anthropocentric considerations from his encounter with the non-human world around him. This is the symbolic incarnation of Heisenberg's man. We increasingly live in a world in which all objects, all things are humanly created, where we rarely ever touch something that is not man-made and intended. And even if it's in some sense natural, we now know it could be man-made and intended, and thus it's only natural insofar as we've made that choice to let it be. And this this life in a man-made world, right, on the one hand gives us incredible grandeur and dignity, like going to space. On the other hand, we have to think about how men now look. Because if we can live out in space, if we can journey to this Archimedean point with respect to the earth, where we can lever the earth, if we apply that to ourselves, if we can lever ourselves, then everything we do is simply a data point. is simply something that can be understood and known and changed, and we become subject to our own machinations and artifice. And so, if we apply this Archimedean points to ourselves, she writes, then our activities will indeed appear to ourselves as no more than overt behavior. In other words, we begin to see ourselves only as we see rats in a maze. We see ourselves as acting according to rules, norms. We can study ourselves just the way we study rats, just the way we study bacteria. And as she says, all our pride in what we can do will disappear, because we become at one with the laws of the universe and lose our freedom, lose our capacity to make humanist as opposed to truthful and scientific judgments. We become part of a large-scale cosmological, biological process. We become part of the singularity. And as she says at the end of the essay, we have come perilously close to this point. We haven't come to this point, and I don't know if she thinks we ever could fully come to this point. But she does believe, and says this in numerous places, that we are increasingly living in a world so so removed from nature and thus fate and fortune, that our earthliness, in a sense our freedom, our spontaneity, becomes increasingly distant and less less meaningful in the world. And this reduces our stature as opposed to dignifying ourselves. So that is the question of the conquest of space and the stature of man. I hope you enjoy the essay, and I look forward to talking to you about it. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you very much.